Hola, bienvenidos. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this 9th webinar in the series entitled U.S. Elections 2020, where we will focus on Mexico-U.S. relations, in particular looking at migration and the many aspects of it. This event is organized by the Universidad de las Américas Puebla, the UDLAP Jenkins Graduate School, and TVUDLAP. I am Carlos Juarez, a professor here at UDLAP and coordinator of the BA program in International Relations. And today I'll be joined by two experts on many topics related to migration, which we'll uncover in a moment, as well as U.S.-Mexico relations. I'm joined by Dr. Marianne Marchand and by Ian McKinley. And as we will look in a moment, I'll ask them to give some brief opening remarks, but then we'll examine several topics in more detail. We will also have some continued input from students and others who will be watching to provide us additional questions along the way. Thank you again for joining us. Let me briefly introduce our two speakers and then ask them to give us some introductory remarks, and we'll go from there. Dr. Marianne Marchand is a professor here at the Universidad de las Américas Puebla in Cholula, and she's also a coordinator of a program on Canadian studies. She's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Cooperation and Research at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, a member of Mexico's SNI, the Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, level 3, and a very accomplished scholar who's also lectured throughout many parts of the world, US, Canada, many parts of Europe, and throughout the Caribbean as well. More recently, she's done a lot of work focusing on aspects of migration, and today she'll share with us some recent work in particular, looking at these caravans of migrants from Central America making their way through Mexico, some of the challenges and aspects of migration mobility. We're also joined today by Mr. Ian McKinley, who's an immigration attorney in Denver, Colorado. He's had a practice there for the past 7 years, where most of his own clients are Mexican migrants. So Ian has a real practitioner perspective working on these topics really on the ground. Ian is a graduate of the Universidad de las Américas Puebla, where he studied international relations and also went on to complete a master's in North American Studies. He also has a law degree from the University of Colorado. Now, before we begin, I'd like to just again mention that any who are listening who have any questions or comments during the session, you can put those in the chat on the right side of the screen. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can put your questions in the comments section. We'll continue collecting these throughout, and we've already gathered many in advance. So let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, we're looking at a very, important topic for us here in Mexico, dealing with the U.S.-Mexico relations, the topic of migration, complex, multifaceted. Sort of to begin with, I want to see if maybe our two speakers can help us unravel some of it, initial context. What are some of the key issues? What are some of the, changing dynamics? Obviously, we're seeing now the Trump administration finishing its 4th year in office. We'll talk a little bit about important reforms or changes, if you will, maybe not so much reforms, but maybe immigration policies that have been in place, what they mean. And of course, as always, we're looking at a likely transition in the U.S., either continuity with Trump or a change in administration to a Joe Biden. And what does that mean for issues of migration? So let me stop on that. We're here to hear from some of our experts. So let me first turn, and perhaps I'll ask if Dr. Marianne Marchand can open with some initial remarks, helping us frame this topic of migration and some of the various aspects that we'll continue talking about. So Dr. Marchand, please, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Dr. Juarez, Carlos. It's very good to see you online through TVUDLAP. And thank also for the organizers, Dr. Stone, the departments of the law department, as well as Marcela Corro and embajador eminente Rafael Stega, que estoy viendo que está también en línea. So everyone, thank you very much for organizing this. And I would like to start with a few comments. The first thing is basically about what is going on right now in terms of the elections and in terms of the topic of migration. And one of my first points, I want to make 3 points to start off, is that unlike the elections of 2016, which were very much framed as one of the major topics, the topic of migration, well, Donald Trump, as we know, was constantly campaigning on build the wall, et cetera, this year, the topic of migration is not one of the major priorities. In other words, what we're seeing right now is that the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the ensuing economic crisis, are two of the topics that are constantly emerging in the debates, in the different news shows, etc., etc. And so it's not that that migration is not important, but these other two topics have taken over. And that means that actually we know a little bit less about the position of the Republicans and of the Democrats in terms of migration issues and migration policy. But briefly, and you can also check the infografias or infographics that some of the students have made, and I really recommend that you read them. What we see is that the Republicans really want to reduce both undocumented immigration, but also legal immigration. And so what we're seeing is that their tactic or their platform is to reduce legal immigration, undocumented immigration, also the inflow of refugees or asylum seekers, while on the other hand, the Democrats try to tend to keep DACA, the deferred action for childhood arrivals, and also increase legal migration and reduce the enforcement of ICE in the workplace. So that is one point that I want to make. So depending on who wins in about 2 weeks' time, we have to really consider three scenarios. One is that Donald Trump wins and is going to hold on to the Senate. The other one is that Biden wins and also wins a majority in the Senate. And then the third option or scenario is that Biden will win, but does not get the majority in the Senate. So I would say at this point, if you believe all the polls and so on, a Trump victory is the least likely scenario. The second scenario where Biden wins and on his coattails, you will also see that the Democrats will win a majority in the Senate, including also having the House majority. That scenario is possible, but also difficult because there are quite a few Senate races that are not so easy to win for the Democrats. And then the final scenario, Biden wins but doesn't have a majority in the Senate. What will happen? It actually will create quite a few problems for the Biden presidency on many fronts. So what I would argue is that Biden, if he wants to make some changes in terms of migration policy, he will have to do so via the so-called executive orders. So not pass them through Congress, because he won't get them past the Senate. Okay, that's the second point. My third point is that whatever migration policies will be developed, they will be developed in the context of other priorities, in particular the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis. And so basically these two things combined will provide the lens through which migration will be sort of looked at and will be developed. And so what we will see is basically a trade-off between migration and migration policies on the one hand, in the context of COVID-19 and the economic crisis. So what I would like to sort of suggest is that possibly if Biden wins, which seems the most likely scenario, the Democrats and the Biden presidency will focus on DACA and expanding regular migration. They will most likely terminate the Remain in Mexico program, which has been put together by the Trump administration for asylum seekers from, in particular, Central America. So what we see now here in Mexico is that, for instance, in Tamaulipas, that there are a lot of people waiting for the US government to make a decision on their asylum petition, right? And so I think that is going to, well, be very difficult. And I think what will happen is that the Biden administration, in a certain way, will try to get rid of the Remain in Mexico program. But then the question is, what are you going to do with all the people that are already at the border? There are a couple of other things, but I think one of the most important, two other important issues, or three actually, are, first of all, Biden has said that he will be reducing the enforcement or the raids at workplaces, and that the Democrats in the Biden presidency would put a halt to the separation of families. Just this morning or yesterday afternoon, an article from the New York Times showed that there are about 545 children that were taken away from their parents. They have not yet been reunified with their parents. They cannot find their parents. So these are minors that are stuck in a system and they don't even know where their parents are. So that is a very problematic situation. And then finally, I think the Biden administration will probably try to discontinue the so-called Secure Communities program, which is about the sharing of information between different branches of the executive, of the government, in terms of informing, for instance, when someone is being ticketed, and then also trace whether or not that person is undocumented in the United States. I will leave it at this just for now. So basically my 3 points are, it really depends on what is going on in terms of how Biden wins, if he wins. The crisis of COVID-19 and the economic crisis will affect migration policies. And finally, that what we're seeing now in the campaigns, that migration has sort of pushed off the agenda a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Marchand. And I'd like to turn now, if we can ask Ian to join us now. And from your perspective, Ian, you're sort of, in some ways, got your hands very much in the nitty-gritty details as a practitioner, somebody who understands the issues, in this case from the U.S. But beyond that, we've also heard, and many of us understand these terms, but I wonder if you might also be able to give us a quick snapshot on some of these issues. DACA, for example, what's the status? And, we hear it as, the Dreamers, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, but just in case there are a few listeners who aren't aware of it, because there are possible changes to that. If there's continuity with the Trump re-election, that might be jeopardized. If there's a Biden presidency, what does it mean for something like that? The other is the Remain in Mexico, and perhaps, Dr. Marchand, we can continue bringing that forward, but this is an important and controversial policy that essentially the Trump administration has forced on Mexico to, address the southern border and the large wave that's been coming. So enough on that. Please, Ian, give us a quick snapshot, an update from your perspective on these important issues of migration.
Thank you, Dr. Juarez. Thank you for the invitation. I would begin with, I concur 100% with everything that Dr. Marchand just said. I think that's a completely accurate analysis of what the politics right now and what the potentials are. And just to frame it in another way, I think it's the policy on migration from Mexico and from the rest of the world in Central America. It stands to be night and day different depending on who's elected. If Biden's elected, he has announced that within the first 90 days publicly, he's going to try to push an amnesty. And so it's going to go in the polar opposite direction as the policy will be as if Trump's reelected. From my personal perspective, I lived in Mexico for many years. My wife's from Mexico. Marianne Marchand studied in the UDLAP. She was my professor during my master's, which, by the way, the information I learned from her has been invaluable in my practice here. But it's just been nightmarish. It has been disgusting and awful. It's been a very, very difficult and frustrating 4 years. If Trump's reelected, it's probably just going to get worse, and it's going to get more cynical and more just nightmarish from our perspective. There's just been a lot of immigration law. It's so much based in policy and how it's applied as opposed to the black letter of the law. And so just like Obama, for example, was able to implement the DACA program via policy, Trump has been able to implement all of these cynical policies that I don't agree with, and that, you know, half the country or more don't agree with, such as using the family separations as a disincentive to get people to come here. And I mean, there's too many to run down again, but there's just so many of them. One of them being that he's tried to end DACA, that he's announced the end of TPS, for example. And so it's been really, really difficult. If Biden wins, we anticipate that all of that is going to loosen up, that basically the attitude towards migration is going to be a lot more humane and generous. And again, he's announced that he's going to try to push an amnesty through in the first 90 days. And so that's going to depend on whether or not the Republicans or the Democrats hold the Senate. Even if the Republicans hold the Senate, I, as a practitioner, am still going to be hopeful that an amnesty might truly pass, because there are a number, I mean, I would say half of the Republican Party prior to Trump's entry on the scene was in favor of some sort of amnesty, some sort of path to status or citizenship portion of the population here. And so depending on what the outcome is and how close it is, I think there is a realistic possibility that Biden could try to pass through an amnesty and give status to the estimated anywhere between 10 and 20 million people that are here without status right now. And so it's just we're at a fork in the road, and a migration policy is going to be so different depending on who's elected. And so, you know, just as a historical context, I kind of coming at this from an academic perspective, and being here, being so frustrated with the policies that my government is implementing, you know, it forces you to ask, like, why is this happening, and try to genuinely understand, like, what's behind this. And what I think the answer is, if you look back at history, right now, immigrants as a percentage of the total population is at its highest point in the United States since the 1920s. It's at about 15%. Back when immigration was that high as a percentage of population, you saw the most restrictive immigration policies in U.S. history be implemented back in the 1920s and the late 19-teens. And so it's kind of an example of history repeating itself. Immigration is at a historical high. And so what you see is, for example, the phenomena that is Donald Trump, who comes along and promises to reduce immigration. There's always been a nativist strand in American politics that doesn't like the foreigner and that doesn't like immigration. And so this is a historical period in which that segment of American politics is emboldened. And so I just, I would tell people at the last election in 2016, when they asked me if Donald Trump could win, I told them that I didn't think he had a chance of winning. And then I could not believe it when he won. So this time around, I'm cautiously optimistic that Biden is going to win. But I'm still nervous, and we'll see in a couple of days here. But politics are really, really tense in the United States right now. And I agree with Marianne that, immigration is going to take place within the context of the economy having been hit extremely hard within the coronavirus still flaring up. And so I do think that regardless of even if Biden were to be elected and he tries to push an amnesty, I think that a focus on enhanced border security and a restriction of future immigration is inevitable, just given the fact that it is at a historical high, that the economy is going to take a downturn, and that's generally when attitudes towards immigrants can turn relatively more hostile. So I think even if Biden is able to pass an amnesty, it's going to come with a lot of enhanced border security measures. And so I think with that, I would open it up. There's just so many topics I could talk about in the individual. And so when I say that, depending on what the politics are going to look like, DACA will likely remain in place if Biden's elected. If Trump's elected, it's probably going to disappear. And likewise for TPS, and likewise for all the policies that Trump's implemented. If he's elected, it's just going to get worse. And if Biden's elected, he's going to start to ease up on it. It's just going to be a question of degree how intensely he does that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian, for some valuable insights there. And as I turn it now, I'm distilling various questions that we've had already posted and a few more that are coming in. And I'll first, pose a few of them and then ask, both of you can respond to it as you wish. But one idea is, and it comes a little bit from what I heard from Dr. Marchand, migration policy or immigration policy for the U.S. is going to be more likely affected by or connected to the pandemic, to the economic recovery? And on one hand, my thought is that that's going to be challenging. In other words, it's number 3 or 4 in the pecking order. However, might there be opportunities or situations where, I don't know, can you envision more areas of cooperation? And we're speaking primarily here if there is a change of government for a Joe Biden. We know that with Trump, if there is a continuity with the re-election, probably more of the same, more chaos, disruption, no coherent strategy, both him and even Mexico's President AMLO, rather populist, inward-looking, not a lot of diplomacy, let's say. Let's assume for a moment a Biden presidency in a scenario that, is looking possible. And yet, as we also heard from you, depends on the outcome in the Senate, because that gives a lot of, either opportunity or constraint. But what areas can we envision, thinking to the future, of either cooperation or otherwise? And I'm also getting at the idea that the border communities very much understand the need for cooperation and coordination. And this whole idea of the building of the wall, it's a hyper nationalism. It's a xenophobia that doesn't come from the border region. It comes from Trump and maybe, more nativist sentiment that tends to be, from my experience, the hardest liners usually are those that are not living at the border, not experiencing it, not understanding it. So anyway, back to this. I mean, we're thinking, and a lot of our questions are kind of like, what can we expect? Even, for example, Joe Biden and relations with AMLO himself. Would he hold AMLO accountable for certain things? Would there be a change in the role of the U.S. pressure for Mexico to, do the dirty work on the southern border? Maybe, address again the situation at the border of the northern border, where you have, the asylum seekers waiting there and conditions deplorable. Anyway, I've spoken enough there, but let me just have each of you kind of continue the dialogue. But some of the questions are, how do we connect it to the pandemic? What can we envision seeing there? And how might future relations between a Biden presidency and AMLO be? So Marianne or Ian, perhaps either of you can take it from there.
Yeah, sure. Look, it's always difficult to sort of judge how people will get along and whether they will get along, et cetera, et cetera. I do have to say, though, that during the Obama administration, also the US government, the Obama government, did do something that we would call an externalization of border controls. Because I'm not sure if people still remember, but there was at one point in the summer of 2014, there were a lot of unaccompanied children that showed up at the US-Mexico border. And so this was with the Obama administration in charge. Obama said, okay, this is a humanitarian crisis. What are we going to do with all these minors showing up? We have to treat them humanely. We have to give them a chance, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, what the administration did was to sort of say to the then Peña Nieto government in Mexico to step up the controls at the southern border. This was called the Plan Frontera Sur. And it's not the same as the militarization that is going on now at the southern border with the National Guard that has been implemented by the López Obrador government. But still, there was a clear pressure on the Peña Nieto government to try to prevent so many people from crossing Mexico and getting to the US border. In this particular case, there were these unaccompanied minors and children. And so I think that something like this might happen, right? Because no government, and you see this also in Europe, see that these sort of receiving states, like the United States, don't want any kind of major tension, major flow of migrants ending up at their borders. So what they're doing is they're outsourcing it and saying to these buffer states, please keep them away from us, right? And so I think that is not something that is going to disappear. Whether or not Biden is going to say, okay, Maybe he wants less militarization. That could be the case. And one of the plans he has announced on his platform is that they want to, I think it's about $4 billion, they want to send to Central American countries, to the Northern Triangle, to try to improve the local conditions, the economic prospects of people, to try to slow down the out-migration of that particular region. But obviously, if it is just economic aid, it's not going to help in terms of the insecurity and the violence in the region. That is not going to disappear with that. And the other thing is that what migration theorists will tell you is when certain regions start to increment their outflow, their growth, then also migratory outflow will increment, emigration will increment. So this is the so-called migration hump. So whether this will help or not, that is just, a question to be seen. I do think that there will be more dialogue with a Biden administration, but the crucial factor here is what is going to happen with the Senate. If there is a Democratic majority, I think what they will try to do is pass legislation that is in accordance with DACA. And so because there was a piece of legislation on the books, the Dreamers, but that never got passed. So I think they will pick that up and try to pass that. So that's legislation, and it's more difficult for any kind of subsequent government to try to overturn that.
Yeah. Again, I agree. There'll absolutely be a more cooperative approach to Mexico if Biden's elected. I don't think it would be possible for a president not to be able to exhibit a more cooperative approach than Trump has demonstrated. And I do agree. I mean, I think there's a absolute recognition that Mexico has a lot of power and influence when it comes to the issue of migration here. It's a binational issue. Obviously, by erecting a wall, you're not going to be able to stop migration. You have to include Mexico in it. Trump has recognized that, and I think as Dr. Marchand said, the Obama administration recognized that. So yeah, that will continue. I mean, it's a binational issue. I don't know about I understand that even within Mexican politics too. I mean, there's certain segments that there's incentives to not see such a flow from Central America through Mexico to the United States. And so I would imagine that Biden would try to find common ground on that issue. At the same time, recognizing that it's a humanitarian crisis right now that's propelling a lot of the migration from Central America. And so, yeah, I can't imagine that the family separation would continue. The family separation of policy is going to continue. The militarization is not going to continue. I mean, there's going to be a really stark move away from everything that Trump has done. And so the DREAM Act, that has been, I mean, Trump tried to pass that even. That's just politically advantageous. So I think Biden would absolutely try to pass the DREAM Act. Although as a practitioner, I mean, he stated that he would try to pass a much larger amnesty than that, because that would only solve a fraction of the problem of illegal immigration here. I mean, the Dreamers are only a fraction of the total number of people that are living here permanently without any sort of lawful immigration status. And so for me, I mean, just personally, and as I see politics, it would be, I think it's a real possibility if the Democrats take the Senate, that there is going to be a push to try to get status for everybody. And again, if that does happen, and with that push, politically, there's also going to be at least lip service paid, and I think genuine policy of trying to prevent future undocumented migration to the U.S. They're going to have to do that if they want to pass an amnesty for the millions of people that are here, if they try to do that. And so, yeah, and the way the coronavirus plays into it too, and the economics, what I'm curious to see how it's going to play out is, having learned in Dr. Marchand's courses that when the economy takes a downturn, the native sentiment is bound to grow, and there's less opportunity, there's more competition between workers. And so on the one hand, there's going to be a tremendous, if Biden wins, a tremendous amount of pressure to pass an amnesty. But at the same time, I think he is going to be cognizant of, you know, whether there might be a backlash, given the fact that the economy right now is struggling in the U.S. and we don't know what that's going to look like the next year. But that's going to be kind of a contradicting force on trying to pass and liberalize the migration laws, is the fact that the economy right now is not in great shape. And so it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. I think there's a lot of uncertainty.
Thank you both for some, again, valuable continued insights. I'm going to bring in again some more questions that we've been getting posted and kind of weave through in some way. But let me just say this first. You know, one of the puzzles that we don't know, of course, we're often, or we continue to speculate what if, and we have a scenario of continuity with Trump and what that means, and maybe the challenges of a transition to a Biden presidency. Clearly, many pieces of the puzzle, nothing can happen overnight, but a couple of quick thoughts. One is, one question speaks to really the Latin American countries to the south, both Central and South America, as they struggle with this pandemic, as they face economic and other, health issues. Can we anticipate a flood? Can we anticipate more waves of them coming? And the other is that, and perhaps particularly Dr. Marchand, you've done recent work on the caravans, and of course they were in the headlines, a year or two ago. They're not at the moment, but my thought there, and some of the questions that deal with social media, because social media both can help us inform people, disseminate information, but also disinformation and rumors, and clearly under Trump, and if it should continue, we have a lot of mixed signals, confusion. What's the rule, and signals to try to disincentivize people from coming, but then others that get maybe confusing signals. At any rate, social media, a mixed blessing, of course, a double-edged sword. So let me just turn to some of you. Some reflections on maybe what can we anticipate from the pandemic as a potential source of more migration, not just Mexico, but from Central and South America, Caribbean as well. And, what are the factors or forces that can somehow bring together a reform of the immigration policy in the U.S.? And any continued thoughts on that, Dr. Marchand?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the mic for just a second. Yes, very interesting, because one of the suggestions that has been made, and there seems already to be some evidence in support of this, is that the caravans from Central Mexico, Central America, started to become lesser and lesser in the summer of 2019, in particular because of the increasing militarization of the southern border by the Mexican government, as a sort of response to the pressures from the U.S. government, because Trump said basically that if these migrants were not being stopped at the Mexico southern border, he would increase a 5% or put a 5% tariff on Mexican exports and increase that every single month with 5% until reaching 25%. So that really stopped the caravans because of the AMLO government sending the National Guards to the southern border. With the COVID crisis, some of the Central American countries, in particular Guatemala, they've really closed down the borders. They put in place a curfew, they closed down their borders, and obviously if you're traveling in some kind of caravan, you're very visible, so it's very easy to stop you, right? It's something else if you're sort of trying to cross on a one-to-one basis a border, but if you're going with thousands of people, you're very visible, so it's easy for a government to stop. The similar things happened in Honduras, in El Salvador, and so what we're seeing is that, and a lot of people prefer to stay at home because they weren't sure what was going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. But what recent information has shown us that because of the economic crisis, and because of a change in the policies of sort of when you're being caught as a migrant, as an undocumented migrant, when you're crossing the border, the US Border Patrol releases you immediately. You're not being put in a detention center for quite a long time, right? So what has happened apparently is that there has been an enormous increase in emigration from Mexico. They start to show the figures from July of this year onward. They captured or they caught about 40,000 people trying to cross the border. And most of them were actually from Mexico. And they interviewed some people who were pushed back into Mexico. And they said, well, you know, we'll try again, because now it's a sort of catch and release kind of policy. So we're not having to go through the system and stay for months or longer in a detention center. So we might as well try to move, because of the economic crisis in Mexico as well, you know, we might as well be better off in the US. So it's a very interesting kind of very recent phenomenon. So I expect, yes, because of the economic situation here in Mexico, that there will be more emigration again. And that slowly people from Central America will also be joining again. They tried about 2 weeks ago. They started the caravan from Honduras, but apparently they couldn't cross Guatemala, so that was a sort of a no-no, and so they returned. But I think that individually people are starting to migrate as well. So I actually think there will be an increase in the next year or so, over the next year or so, in emigration because of the economic situation.
Mm-hmm. And I'll turn to Ian in just a moment, but what I'm thinking here, again, if we can envision a Biden presidency, perhaps less emphasis on the securitization and militarization and sort of, you know, apprehension and all that, and more of a focus, as we see in Mexico, at least in name, by AMLO, the humanitarian aspect, you know, the social, political, underdevelopment conditions. Of course, easy to identify those, but, you know, it's just a challenge for the U.S. to handle that. As I often teach in my own course, where we learn about the root causes of particularly Central America, a lot of it is embedded in, you know, relations between the U.S. and the region from the 70s and 80s, and networks, you know, many who came in earlier times ended up in prisons and then returned now as some of these criminal gangs that are running the countries, if you will. Let me turn briefly, and this is just an interesting question, and you know, you will recall that President AMLO visited Washington, D.C. and Donald Trump this past July, I believe it was, where they signed the you know, renegotiated USMCA agreement. Traditionally, the U.S. and Mexico are, you know, very important allies, and every time there's a new president, one of the first usual ritual visits is to visit the neighboring country. It didn't happen with these two presidents, both because AMLO is not a global traveler. I think he's never left the country until this last trip. And similarly, Trump, not a welcome visitor to Mexico, even though he came during the campaign. But really, one of the questions here is that let's assume a Biden victory. Will he be able to effectively, you know, or wait, what will happen to the friendship that AMLO and Trump developed, this most recent one? Will Biden be able to develop that same? Difficult to say there. I'm curious, maybe what thoughts you might have. To me, you know, because Trump is a real transactional president, it's almost like all you have to do is say a few good things about him, go there and you know, behave properly and give him some adulation, and it will go well. But also understand that for the U.S. and for him, what's in it for the U.S.? What can he deliver? What can he say he got from the deal that can make him seem the winner? Those are obviously not the rules of traditional diplomacy. Perhaps under Biden, we would expect more maybe mutual respect and more addressing Mexico's interests and the very deep interconnection of the two countries that all of us know are there. We don't hear a lot about that today, but clearly there's just at all levels, economic, you know, social, you know, cultural, deep connections. Let me turn to Ian. I mean, any thoughts yourself on, you know, some of these recent things we've talked about here, or even things, I mean, from your vantage point, Biden, you know, how would he get along with President of Mexico, as you understand it to be?
I mean, I think, like, a lot of people here, and me personally, and people who are praying that Biden wins, is that Trump has just been a historical catastrophe for the country. I mean, he's genuinely an embarrassment. And so what he's done, Biden's going to have to repair a lot of relationships, not just with Mexico. But I think absolutely it's going to be a priority to try to restore the U.S.'s image after these hopefully just 4 years of Trump. And Mexico being one of the ones that he's very conscientious of, that the image of the U.S. and Mexico, I can't imagine what it was compared to prior to the Trump relationship. I just assume it's drastically worse. And so my guess is that, yeah, absolutely, there's going to be a very concerted effort for Biden to try to, paint Trump as just kind of that, as like a historical phenomenon and catastrophe. And like Obama said prior to the Trump administration, he kind of warned the world that there was going to be a temporary lapse in American leadership. And so I imagine that the narrative would be that, this isn't what the U.S. represents. This was just a blip on the radar, and we're going to go back to respectful diplomacy, to looking at Mexico as one of our closest allies and one of our greatest strategic partners, economic, political, and social. And so there's going to be a real concerted effort to repair the relationship. As far as AMLO, I would assume that he's kind of just understanding that it's in the nation's best interest to get along well with the United States. And so, give Trump a couple of insults, and that's all, or a couple of compliments, and that's really what it takes to get on his good side. And so I would assume that he would embrace and welcome a Biden presidency, because they both have more of a similar worldview. With migration, for example, there's going to be a much more humane policy and treatment from Biden. And so, yeah, that's my perspective on it. I mean, it's been a catastrophe with, somebody who lived in Mexico for so many years. I just had my jaw drop these past 4 years, especially as it pertains to migration from policy, the policy of migration from Mexico. And so, the one thing I do think that Biden is going to have to face is that right now, while he's going to want to take a more humane approach, he's going to make the political calculation and understand that part of the reason that Trump did get elected, I think, does have to do with this phenomenon that migration in the U.S. as a percentage of the population is at a historical high point. And so, to just push through and allow migration to, I don't know if I think what he's going to try to do is pass an amnesty, but then at the same time shore up migration and focus more on border enforcement and try to work with Mexico and other countries in the region to stop the flow of illegal immigration, because it is genuinely seen as an issue on a number of different fronts here. He's going to have to address that politically if he wants to try to pass a number of other really good immigration policies, for example, the DREAM Act or a larger amnesty, ending of some of the policies on the border that Trump has implemented. And so I think he really is going to face also some pressure to, and also given the fact that the economy is in a downturn right now, to at least pay lip service and show that steps are being made to at least address the issue of undocumented immigration to the U.S., while at the same time liberalizing a lot of the other policies. So it'll be interesting to see.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Marianne, I don't know if you had any follow-up to that, or, much as he was describing there, I think for our listeners, we should understand that obviously under Obama, we did have the important Dreamers Act, the DACA, but in general, the U.S. has not had a comprehensive reform of immigration really since the mid-1980s, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, 1986 perhaps. And, it's one of these challenges that, especially today, we have very little bipartisanship. We have a polarized nation. Immigration is a sensitive, emotional, powerful issue. And of course, Trump has taken it to one extreme. If Biden comes in, he'll try to manage that. But I guess my concern here is that, how can we find that critical juncture? Because crisis presents opportunity, of course, and in the end, it's really going to be a matter of what is the outcome of the election. Do they control the Senate sufficiently, the Democrats that is, to really move forward a reform, which is the amnesty, the path to citizenship, addressing DACA, and yet at the same time addressing real concerns of many Americans about the border, about controlling it. So there has to be some reform that includes that also, right? So as someone, Marianne, who has obviously looked at this immigration over the years, you've seen the relations between these two countries ebb and flow. At the moment, they're at one of the worst. Obviously, there's not a lot of, especially among the top leadership. But what are your thoughts about, again, either the challenges, the prospects for any immigration reform, and, you know, all these things that we've been talking about now? Go ahead.
Okay, well, always a tough question, you know, what to do. I would think, I mean, if I were Biden, I wouldn't go for an overall, you know, migration policy. I think that would be too difficult to pass. So I would rather, you know, I would say better to go for sort of partial kinds of legislation, you know, the dreamers, maybe a sort of a partial amnesty, but not try to do a sort of an omnibus migration legislation. I don't think that would fly. I think that would create so many problems. Obviously, it depends on how well they're doing in the elections, and maybe say, well, let's grab this opportunity and do that and be very bold about it. But I see Biden more as a person who is, as he was saying, you know, I want to try to work with the other side of the aisle and so on, and both sides of the aisle. And so I'm not sure that really he's going to go for an overall overhaul of migration policy. I do think that he will be working on sort of turning DACA into the DREAM Act, right? Or reviving the DREAM Act if you want. I do think that he will open up more paths towards citizenship. And I do think he wants to expand, but in a more, well, you can do that both through legislation or just by an executive order. Expand regular migration into the US. So possibilities for coming as a skilled, unskilled, et cetera, migrant. And I think those are the three areas where he will be working. And in terms of enforcement and border protection, I think what they will do is go more for the sort of a smart border kind of initiative, like we saw in the, you know, just after 2001 and 2004, 2005. So not a physical wall, which doesn't make any sense, but be more reliant on biometrics, you know, those kinds of things. So I think that's where he will be going. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I you know, maybe we all want this sort of amnesty of these undocumented people living in the US. But I think if he does something like that, it will be partial. He won't be able to provide amnesty for 11 million people. I don't think that would be realistic. And I do think, I mean, there are already sort of these frameworks or mechanisms for regional cooperation in terms of migration. And with Central American countries, with Canada, actually basically from Panama to Canada. And so I think they may be using some of that. They may be going for these individual sort of bilateral kinds of agreements with Central American countries, with Mexico. And we should not forget, I mean, in terms of López Obrador, I hate to say this, but international politics or relations are not, or diplomatic relations are not very high on his agenda, right? And really, in terms of migration, what I'm seeing toward, for instance, return migrants from the US getting back to Mexico, either being deported or returning voluntarily, or trying to support migrants who are now in the US and really stuck with COVID, et cetera, there's been relatively little done additionally to what previous governments have been doing. So it's not a very, you know, a top issue for the AMLO government. What is, I think the priorities are much more domestic priorities. It's not international politics or Mexicans abroad, unfortunately, I would say.
So in effect, and we're going to see this throughout the world, but countries are going to be kind of looking inward to deal with their immediate here and now, both for their own political survival if they're elected officials, but also because that's where the hurt is. People, it's a public health crisis, it's an economy that has been brought to a standstill, and of course it affects migration, because at the end of the day, Central Americans already poor and having serious challenges, facing more difficulty. It's going to just put more pressure on them. Let me just quickly, as we finish now, I've got a couple of other good questions to turn to. One speaks really about the challenge of Central America, and whether it requires some sort of a so-called Marshall Plan, obviously addressing, a massive infrastructure development and economic improvement. Now, at the end of the day, and certainly many American officials will always say this, for decades, the U.S. has supplied a lot of money, different kind of aid. Now, the government institutions there are weak, corruption is rampant. A lot of the aid tends to be, in past years, especially a lot of military aid, and that's not really building, let's say, democracy or trust. So it is a big challenge. But obviously, at the end of the day, we might expect under Biden a little more focus on that, on the social economic conditions, a little more in sync with AMLO. I'm less familiar with how much Mexico has actually done, because AMLO initially came out speaking about that, the need for a more humanitarian approach, but eventually he gets his arm twisted by Trump to take on the dirty work with the Guardia Nacional in the South. But let me turn to another interesting question, and this speaks really to the situation today. Even under this pandemic, we have a large labor pool of undocumented, irregular, migrants from Mexico and elsewhere who are in the U.S. And in this period of pandemic, they are essentially, working under terrible conditions without financial or health support, similar, to what others, maybe DACA recipients, might receive. So one of the questions here is, could we expect, again, with a transition to a Biden or a changed Congress, perhaps more relief program, new policies that might address and support these essential workers that are critical for the infrastructure, whether it's service sector, agriculture, other areas where, again, many of the migrant workers coming from Mexico are concentrated, and yet they're often on the margins, especially the illegal, undocumented ones. So, what might we anticipate in the future, in terms of protection, support, relief for these, these communities? And any quick thoughts, either, Ian, from your perspective on the ground, or Marianne, maybe from this macro level? Go ahead, Ian.
I believe the House, actually, what they were fighting to get was relief included for undocumented farm workers, for example, who were essential, and lots of undocumented immigrants who, on the one hand, were deemed essential, but on the other hand, were left out of the relief program. And so, yeah, I think that would be a priority of the Democrats, and they would see that as wise and just policy, and that's what they would try to do. I absolutely think so. The Republicans weren't going to allow that. It was one of the talking points about why they shouldn't, the House bill was defective, is that they wanted to give money to, undocumented immigrants and whatnot. So they use that as a specific attack point against Democrats. So if Biden were elected, yeah, I do think they would try to pass another stimulus and try to include relief to undocumented immigrants, knowing that they're a vital part of the economy. And just one point, I would say that Dr. Marchand, I agree that it would be difficult to try to pass an omnibus bill that provided a pathway for the 11 million people. He's on record, though, saying that he's going to try to pass that within the first 3 months. And I do think there's like a historic opportunity right now. The immigration system here is so broken. For example, when somebody gets placed in deportation proceedings, it can take anywhere between 5 and 8 years to be able to complete that process. Lines for petitioning adult children and brothers and siblings in some countries, for example, from Mexico, are like 20 years long and 15 years long. So it's really ridiculous. There's an estimated between 11 million and 20 million people here without a visa. And there's something like less than 10,000 ICE agents who would ostensibly be tasked with finding everybody. So mathematically, it's not possible to deport all of the undocumented immigrants. Obviously, there's 250 immigration judges. And so I think that there's a dam building, and there may be a historic opportunity for something huge to happen with immigration law. I'm keeping my fingers crossed because that would be fantastic.
Excellent.
Yes, I mean, Ian, I'm with you. I mean, it would be wonderful, and I would be the first one to applaud and everything, you know, despite possible flaws in such a legislation. But yeah, I mean, there's the migration system in the US is broken, right? And they need to overhaul it, and I totally agree with that. I'm just trying to think realistically in terms of the politics of it, and I think that's where the problem is. So yes, my reaction is yes, that should happen. Whether it can be done, that's another thing. So that's why I'm saying, you know, the incremental approach may be a bit better. But
the Gang of Eight, which is a group of Republicans then Democrats, they had written a comprehensive amnesty that just wasn't able to pass the House. So
yeah,
it's going to be very interesting what happens.
Yeah. So yes, and I do think, and also I totally agree. I mean, there's been a lot of talk also through civil society organizations and so on, and migrant groups, in particular in the US, that what's going on is they're seen, many of these migrants are seen as essential workers, but also as expendable workers, right? So they have to go to work. They are not provided with the PPE, you know, the personal protective equipment and things like that. And there, for instance, if you work on a farm or if you're close to a meat packing factory, you're often even put in housing provided by the employer. But they're put so many people in these in this housing, in these, you know, barracks, basically, that's where they start to get even more infected. I mean, it's and unfortunately it's not just in the US, but also in Europe, in Germany and some other countries in Europe, where, for instance, there have been these outbreaks of COVID infections at meatpacking plants because of the situation in which they put the migrant workers. And the same thing is true for the for the farm workers. So I think that's where the Democrats can do a lot of good things in terms of saying, okay, if you're an essential worker, you have the right to have that kind of protection, etc., etc. You know, maybe healthcare, all these kinds of things. The other thing that I think is very interesting to see is that the Trump administration basically closed down everything related to visa applications because of COVID-19, with the exception of the visas for farm workers. And so it's, I mean, this is even from their own page, from the Department of Homeland Security, right? If you wanna apply for any kind of visa, forget it for now. But you are allowed to apply for an H-1A visa, for instance. So that's to show that they even recognize that they need these essential workers. So I find that very, you know, quote unquote, ironic.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing these remarks here. And, you know, we've really just got in the last 1 or 2 minutes. One of the things, you know, we've talked a lot about, well, the what ifs. And of course, we have a lot of uncertainty. We don't know yet the outcome of the elections and what that will portend. So we may have continuity with what we have talked about, or we may have some change. But that aside, I wonder if maybe each of you could reflect quickly. And what I'm wondering here is, the last few years, certainly under Trump, we've seen a tightening of the border, anti-immigrant policy, but also maybe on a larger trend, waves of, or let me see how to rephrase this, and perhaps you can clarify, Marianne, how this is said, but that the Mexican migration has kind of evened out so that there are, you know, many people returning, maybe not as many coming as there used to be, different flows. A lot of the growth these days of the Mexican and Latino community is more natural growth, not so much immigration, but simply, you know, population growth internally. But now with this pandemic, it has also made it more difficult to move across. The border has been, again, somewhat more constrained. And maybe I'm just trying to get at here in this last minute. I mean, any quick thoughts on, you know, what does does that mean for the future of migration? Are we going to see, I don't know, some people having doubts about whether is it worth going to the U.S. because of all that uncertainty, or is it more difficult to do the crossing, etc.? So I apologize. We literally have like a last minute. So any final remarks, either on that or reflecting on anything else, Dr. Marchand?
Yeah, just very quickly, as I mentioned before, apparently there's now an increase in Mexican emigration to undocumented emigration to the U.S. And they've been interviewing people in the migrant shelters on this side of the border, and the Mexican side of the border, and people said, well, it's actually now easier to get to the U.S. because the border patrols do a sort of a catch and release. So if I'm being caught crossing undocumented the border, they'll put me across the border and I can try again next day. So how long? But I do think that the economic situation here in Mexico will create a certain kind of push factor.
Yeah, and we will likely see it as well from Central America, from South America, as conditions from the pandemic, from the economic crisis continue. Well, listen, we're going to have to stop on this. I apologize. We're really at the end of our say. But Ian, I want to really thank you, an opportunity to hear from you, an alumni who is now on the ground there as a practitioner dealing with these issues very much at the forefront. Dr. Marchand, of course, thank you for your insight, your expertise on this topic. It's complex, it's ever moving, and of course, we'll have to wait and see in the next couple of weeks the outcome. And even there, this is, as you said, incremental, it's challenging, and in the political environment now, very tough to imagine, a full comprehensive reform, but maybe piecemeal, we can see some improvement. For all of us those of you who joined us today, thank you for this opportunity to have a discussion, a dialogue on this important topic of the day, part of the election series being organized here on behalf of the Universidad, las Américas Puebla, and all those who helped bring this together. Thank you for participating in this webinar, and we wish you well. And please stay tuned for other events in the same series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Bye, Ian. It was great to see you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes.
Gracias. Thank you, Marianne, for all your help, and Ian.
Carlos.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing and keeping us on track.